Hello, my name is Marcel Jung. I'm a team lead for M&E in North America, and I'd like to take you through the next demo, which I call Arnold Workflow 1, hopefully one of more to come. And the topics that I'd like to cover in this demo are listed here on this first slide. So the first two are nParticles and MASH to build complex geometry very quickly. And what I'd like to build is a truss-based tubing system that will make up the ceiling to one of the hangars in the Dreadnought's content. I also want to use curve rendering as a way to render larger volumes of geometry quicker, as well as stand-ins to do the same. And then, of course, we'll also be talking about IES photometric lights, as well as a sky dome. And in the end, we'll add something like an atmospheric volume node to elevate the level of realism. So with that, let's go ahead and move to this next slide, where on the left you can see the idea of what I'm after, where we look at this tubular structure that's connected through these spherical nodes. And on the right, you can see what it looks like integrated into a scene. So here's our hangar, and the top is open. That's where we want to create that system. And in order for me to be able to create that, the easiest way would be to start with a piece of reference geometry, such as a basic box. And I elevated it in the middle to kind of break up the boxy kind of nature and the flat kind of ceiling that this would that would generate. So let's go ahead and move this in place roughly where I want it. And then I no longer need to look at the hanger. We can just essentially focus in on this piece of geometry and fill it with particles. So that's the first thing to do, is to jump into the effects menu and go to nParticles and fill the object with, and if we reset this, we can set the resolution to 24 and fill that with particles. So let's look at that real quick. You can see how these particles are filling that box, and it gives me a decent resolution that I can use to base this truss-based system on. I no longer need the geometry. I do want to play this back to see if there's anything else connected to it, and you can see that the nucleus node is driving the motion. It has gravity associated with it and so on. So we want to delete that as well, so that we're left with just nothing but fixed particles. So the next step would be to attach a MASH node to it. And what's nice about MASH is that I can actually, through utilities, add a trails node to this particle system. And so when I do that, I don't want it to create trails because I have moving points or moving particles. I want it to actually connect each particle by a piece of geometry. So I'm going to set this to connect to nearest, and then as I dial up or down the max number of trails, you can see that there's more geometry being generated. So I'm going to set that max limit to something fairly high, like that, and then I want to increase the count to have the number of connections between individual particles increase. And so you can see that with a value of 8, we're actually getting something that is fairly representative of what I want to create. So this piece of geometry is great, but that's not really what I want to create. In the end, what I want to create is a tubular system that is connected with spherical nodes. So these are just flat faces that are extruded as a result of having a scaling value on the trails node. So for example, if I look at the trails node, you can see that there's a trail scale. It's just simply extruding from that base edge. So I essentially want to select all those base edges and then duplicate that into actual curves. So the way to do that would be to say, let's pick the geometry. Under modeling mode, we'll go into the UV editor and grab all these faces and normalize all these faces to 0 to 1 texture space. So normalize, open up the dialog, and we'll set this to each face as a separate object. So we'll go ahead and apply that. And once it's done, I can select the entire piece of geometry as an object and select all the edges that I need to duplicate into surface curves. So right click edge, and we'll grab all these left side edges, which are all the edges connecting this whole network of tubes. So these are all the edges that are connecting all the particles. So with that, let's go to curves and duplicate these surface curves, and it's going to take a while, but it is worth the investment. It's creating about 4,000 curves, and you can do this at a low resolution. Of course, you can set the particle fill value to a lower resolution, not 24, but something below that. In this case, I want the complexity because in the final render, that's really what's going to look good. So Once this is done, these curves are starting to pop into the outliner, and what I'd like to do at this point, before I actually put them in what's called a curve collector, I want to get rid of the original trails geometry. So let's dump that. And then we'll select all these curves and put them, let's go ahead and drag this all the way down here and create a curve collector. So using a curve collector is really a new way of using sets. So in the past you had to create a set and then add custom attributes through the Arnold tab. Now you can see all these curves live inside of this curve collector, which has a bunch of attributes associated to the way these curves render. So what I'd like to do is set this to thick, which will render tubes, give it a width, and then we can also assign a shader so it shades and renders a certain way. In this case, I'll use the AI standard surface shader, the Arnold 5 shader. So right now all we have in the scene is a whole bunch of curves and some points, some particles. So we want to replace the particles with spheres. We've already set up our curves. Now we want to go ahead and duplicate or replicate geometry for these particle points. So let's create a sphere, and we'll do that again through mesh. And so in this case, I want to create a mesh network that is an instance network, and then connect this mesh network to my particles. So let's select the particles, let's select mesh, and then through the mesh utilities menu, I can connect nParticles to mesh. So this is what we have right now, and we can select our sphere, original sphere that's hidden, and scale that down to maybe a scale of 0.06. And so now if I were to, let's say I wanted to see this, we can create a sky dome light, get a little closer, and render out an image of what we've created so far. And if my spheres are not big enough, we can just go back to our sphere and maybe increase the size of this just a little bit, like 1/100th of a unit, and get something just a tad bigger. I'm not really going to worry about the shader. I'm going to fix that problem in the stand-in. So once I've created a stand-in from this, which is really the next step. So the first thing I want to do is grab the hanger and expose it and say, okay, you can check the fit here if you wanted to. But this hanger needs to be turned into a stand-in. So I'm going to go to Arnold, stand-in, export, and I export this as an env.ass, Arnold source scene. So let's export that and overwrite that. And then the next thing I need is the node called curve collector and the node called mesh instancer. What's nice about this is I can select as many nodes as I need and export them as a single instance. And what's nice about this too is that it can be curve geometry. It can also be instance geometry. If you wanted to, you can go to duplicate special and instance geometry that way. That can be included and exported as a stand-in, or if you do it through mesh, which is what I did. And so in this case, let's go ahead and export this instance, and we'll go ahead and call this env truss underscore roof.ass. And also make sure that you export the bounding box. When you're replicating lots of stand-ins, you want to make sure that you don't have to, for each of those stand-ins, redraw, recalculate the bounding box as you're making copies. That actually does take up time. So let's go ahead and export this. And we're essentially done. As soon as it reports the result in the command line, you know that you can move on to the next step. And so if I get rid of all of everything that I had open, I can now just simply bring in stand-ins.